All right, so today I'm going to be talking about a practical approach to teaching reproducibility, and I'm going to focus on the practical part, right? So often we read these theoretical papers that explain to us why it's so important to conduct reproducible research, and we think about all of the changes we want to make to our own personal research and teaching practice, but the realities of our lives constrain our ability to adapt and change. And so I want to think about how to incorporate reproducibility into our teaching and research workflow in a way that feels more painless. Now let's talk a little bit about reproducibility, and I know I am preaching to the choir here. You folks know a lot about this, but I'm going to introduce some different terms and ways of thinking about reproducibility, and they dialogue with ways that other people have talked about this issue in the past, and so I want to acknowledge that. What we see here is a graph from Goodman et al. 2016 that shows the frequency with which, or rather the percent by discipline, with which individuals and publications are mentioning the word reproducible. And all of these messy colors refer to different disciplines. I am in psychology, which is that PP right here. And what we can see is that while there is certainly a large difference in how much people are talking about reproducibility across the scientific disciplines, we see a steep increase. And in particular, in the last 10 years or so, conversations about reproducibility have become much more robust. Now, this raises some challenges because now we're in a situation where many scientists, I might even say most, have heard about the idea of reproducibility, but we all might have slightly different working definitions of this idea. So the way I like to think about it is do it again ability. That came from one of my students. I hate to say that I did not invent such a beautiful phrase, but it's our ability to repeat something. Right? And what that something is depends on who you are. So when we first began talking about reproducibility, Claremont was saying things like, okay, reproducibility is really about a procedure to get from a data to an output, right? So that we can kind of recreate or reproduce all of the pathways that we took from getting something like zeros and ones or some kind of data set all the way to a figure or a table or something like that. And we can think about this as being an issue primarily of transparency, right? It's not a black box where we insert data in and out comes some kind of output. Instead, we need to be able to understand what manipulations happened to the data, how did we get from point A to point B, and we need to be able to know that in order to be able to do it again. The test here for reproducibility is, given the same data set and the same tools, can you get the same output? This is a fun activity to do with students. I will give them a data set, I will give them a set of analyses, and I'll say, do it in like 3 different statistical programs. Do you get the same output? And it's a nice demonstration of being able to follow a procedure and calculate, for example, the mean, and a demonstration that there's consistency across statistical platforms, which, believe it or not, still kind of surprises students. And maybe you've had the unfortunate experience of revisiting an old data set with a new statistical package, running it, and then being like, hey, good, okay, it worked. That's great, that's fantastic, I reproduced my own work. Whew. So that's one way of thinking about reproducibility. Goodman et al. Kind of broadened the conversation about reproducibility, or at least named a broadening that had already existed in the literature. So they talked about methodological reproducibility. Can we do the study again? Results reproducibility. Can we get to the same kind of analyses? This is pretty close to the original definition of reproducibility. And inferential reproducibility. In other words, across a wide range of methods and analyses, do we arrive at the same inferences about what is true in the world? And so that would really capture issues like replication efforts that have attempted to measure the extent to which we can reproduce data that creates a foundation upon which to draw a particular inference. Now, for my classes, I talk about 3 different types of reproducibility, and they really do overlap theoretically and in substance with some of these other definitions, but I want to highlight them. So one is prose-based. reproducibility, which basically means, hey, we are, as researchers, our bread and butter is writing and reading papers. And that fundamentally means that what we're doing is we're using language to communicate about and learn about science, even though most of the stuff we're learning about, the raw format of the data is not linguistic, right? It's some other format. And so prose-based reproducibility means that we need to be able to read and write documents that can convey in language accurately all the things that happen so that we can reproduce it. And I'll give you some examples later. We have analytic reproducibility, which is what Claire Bout's talking about. Can we actually reproduce the analyses given the data set? And design reproducibility, which is close to Goodman's idea of inferential reproducibility, but not quite the same. Design reproducibility is the idea, okay, we acknowledge that there are bajillions of researcher degrees of freedom. In other words, researchers have lots of choices about what they do, what kind of data they collect, how they collect those data, what choices they make as they're pruning the data, as they're reanalyzing the data, as they're presenting their final analyses, as they're constructing a figure like this. Can we reconstruct the logic of those choices? In other words, acknowledging that you could have made 1,000 other choices that you didn't make. Is there enough information presented so that you can recreate the logical path that you went down to make the choices that you made? So those are the 3 types of reproducibility that I'm going to be talking about today. Now, to zoom out a little further, and I know, again, you folks are here because you're interested in reproducibility, but we might ask, why do we care about reproducibility? And for me, there's 2 core reasons, and I just want to highlight it because this has deeply shaped the ways in which I have engaged in the past decade or so with efforts towards improving reproducibility in psychological science. The first issue is one of quality. High-quality research must be reproducible. I strongly believe that if it is not reproducible, it is not high quality. And the reason is that no matter how amazing your finding is, if no one else can check it in any possible way, then it's as good as a myth, right? It's just a fairy tale. Even if the science was really, really good, no one else has any way of knowing. So work that is not reproducible is not high quality and does not, I would argue, contribute to the scientific literature. And I know I take a very strong stance here, and I am someone with an imperfect record in reproducibility, right? It was not something that was taught to me in graduate school. My ability to archive the steps I've taken has changed and improved year by year, right? It's a process of shifting towards a more reproducible science. I am not a perfect example, and yet I still believe that any of my work that is not reproducible is not a meaningful, high-quality contribution to the scientific literature. It's just not. It was a good try, good for you, Jess, but it's not getting there. The second issue is one of access. And as communities within the sciences are beginning to more seriously dialogue with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of the cornerstone pieces of this, I think, absolutely needs to be thinking about who has access to the methods, to the analytical tools, and to the ability to verify our body of scientific knowledge. Efforts to increase reproducibility necessarily involve more transparency, more data sharing, more access to proprietary materials, and as a result, that diversifies the pool of individuals who can be meaningfully involved in our science and who can meaningfully understand our science without some kind of secret mentor interpreter who can tell you the secret sauce that created the scientific finding you're interested in. So I see reproducibility efforts as being absolutely central to creating a more inclusive and diverse science. And so, in my world, right, that means more data sharing, right? It means collaborating with large multi-lab collaboratories. So I'm involved with Many Babies, which is a collaboration internationally aimed at replicating and verifying important findings in the infancy literature. And as part of that group, we do all sorts of things like making all of the materials, many of which are very hard to create, took a lot of hours and grant funding to create, available to anyone who wants to use these methods. transparent conversations around analytic choices, etc., and ones that are truly non-hierarchical. Right? So engaging in conversations about research practices in a non-hierarchical fashion in order to increase the reproducibility of our science and the inclusivity of our science. So this is why I am committed to reproducibility. It also just makes my life easier. As I get older, I forget more things. It's a lot harder to keep a mental catalog of everything I've done and how I've done it. And so leaving myself this breadcrumb trail selfishly is also extremely useful. Now, the issue is, for many people, perhaps even some of you who are in this virtual room right now, we are time-strapped and we know we're not doing a good enough job. I know I'm still not doing a good enough job. How on earth are we supposed to change our lab practices and our teaching practices when we already don't have enough time? And this has been amplified, certainly by the pandemic, and disproportionately so for women and for individuals in marginalized communities. You see here my family, also known as my co-workers for the last year. And the pressures that the pandemic has put on my time schedule has really forced me to prioritize, right? I might have 20 working hours a week, and it's not during my ideal time period, right? It's not during the first 3 hours when I'm most awake, and it's not always when I plan it. And so this has forced me in a way that I think so many of us are already routinely forced by our overbooked typical week schedule. I mean, this is like a typical week pre-pandemic for me. You can see all the meetings that are in there, and maybe I have a few free chunks of time. We have to pick and choose what we focus our energy on. And at the end of the day, when we have institutional structures and funding structures that still do not adequately prioritize reproducibility, it is very easy to say, I will do everything to maintain my lab, to maintain my research students' experiences, to ensure that I update my teaching materials relatively regularly. I'm going to do all that. You know what? The massive shift to a more reproducible science, it's not this year. It's not going to happen this year. And that's a very reasonable choice. Now, this year, I made a slightly different choice. So I was in a position where I knew that in the spring I was going to have to teach this class called Cognitive Development with Lab. And this class is a 300 level course in the psychology department. It's an advanced, some would say like a capstone, methods-based class. It counts as a lab course in the natural sciences. It also counts as an advanced mathematics course. It's also a writing intensive course. There's a lot going on here. It is a small course, though. I have fewer than 20 students. And in a normal semester, and by normal I mean no pandemic, I make some slightly different choices in this class. So previous iterations of this class, I've used the teaching replication approach that I first learned about from Mike Frank and Rebecca Sachs in 2012, where we try to replicate existing studies. Here are two of them that my students helped me to replicate and post the replications onto Open Science Framework. In other iterations of the class, we have designed and tested novel studies, which we have then gone on to publish. So this is a really cool class. It's extremely hands-on, and we have the time and space to really dig in. The problem is I am a developmental psychology researcher. My research happens in person next to human children. And in a pandemic, I just can't do that. So everything about this class could not stay the same. I had to change. And even though many of the practices that we had been using in this class were already excellent examples of kind of training towards a more reproducible science, I knew I had to make major adaptations. In a normal semester, my students would be volunteering for several hours a week in the local preschool. They would also be driving off-site during the lab period in order to collect the data, and they would be like manipulating actual stimuli and like practicing all of the amazing, very hands-on, very COVID unfriendly practices of developmental psychology research. So I was sitting here being like, what am I gonna do? I need a solution. I have almost no time because there's children running around my house all the time. And I want whatever change I make to be one that helps me personally and also pushes forward my larger goals of creating a classroom environment that really trains reproducibility. So it was under this moment of tremendous pressure and constraint that I had an idea. And the idea is, in this present virtual class that's conducted in a Zoom room, I was going to base the class almost entirely on my in-prep and under-review work. In other words, every week what they read is either a recently published paper, a paper that's under review or revision, or a paper that's in preparation. And my idea here was that this was going to afford me so many opportunities to teach about reproducibility in the way that it is implemented in my lab. And at the same time, even if students couldn't collect data from children in the way that they normally would, they could get experience every step of the way in research. And as I mentioned at the beginning, when I think about reproducibility, I'm not just thinking about it at the moment of analysis, although I will talk about that. I'm thinking about reproducible practices from start to finish. And so what better way to do that than to have students kind of learn about my research as it's happening? As an obvious side effect, this forces me to do my research. And I will be honest, right now I am scrambling. I have some papers that are assigned for later this semester that are not written. They're just not written. So there's some trade-offs here, some practical ones, so I do want you to know the risks involved. But I want to highlight many of the exercises that we've been using to focus on reproducibility in a way that is helping me to teach better and helping me to get my research done. Because I think many of these could be adapted to a wide array of contexts outside of the field of psychology and outside of this particular class. So we're emphasizing all elements of reproducibility, and I'm going to walk through how we do that. So let's start with prose-based reproducibility and this incredibly creepy image that I found online. Why did I choose this image? Scientific writing requires translation, right? If you're like me, you have a bunch of spreadsheets. They have thousands of rows. They could have tens to hundreds of columns. Those spreadsheets were generated by some other process, right? If you're like me, maybe you showed kids some drawings and asked them some cute questions. If you're not like me, maybe you conducted a survey, or maybe you literally counted things that you saw in the world, right? Whatever your data source was, you went through some process to acquire that data source. You then converted it into a spreadsheet. You converted those spreadsheets into analyses. You converted those analyses into conclusions. And all of that had to be translated into language. And I want to be really clear that active translation is non-trivial, right? Anytime we're translating, there's a risk of data loss, of data augmentation, and of miscommunication. And so one of the fundamental goals for reproducibility must be that our prose is reproducible. So our learning goal was to practice translating between prose and non-prose representations of the research that we do. And now there's kind of two activities that I'm going to focus on for today. One is to write a methods section. I put a little star there because you're like, well, everyone writes a methods section, Jess. That is not a novel pedagogical practice. That is not about reproducibility. I'm going to show you some ways I do it, and I'm going to argue that the act of writing a methods section and of truly refining your ability to write that section is a fundamental skill in creating a more reproducible science. The second activity, which I'm actually going to start with first to explain to you, is to reenact a method section. So what does that mean? Well, it's not replicating a study, right? We're not able to go out into the community and replicate work. That doesn't mean we can't take all of the steps that the researchers took in order to feel what the study feels like. So let me give you an example of how I do this. The only material you probably need is the method section and any supplementary materials from a journal article. You may need some stimuli. You may choose to make them yourself, or you can do what I do and say, all right, students, one of your pieces of homework for this class is to read this paper carefully enough that you know what stimuli to make. Now that's a really frustrating assignment for them, for exactly an important pedagogical reason, which is that 9 times out of 10, they're going to read the method section and say, I'm sorry, what did this picture look like? I don't know. Or, I'm sorry, they said that they asked about income, but I'm actually not sure how they asked that question. And so this very act of gathering the stimuli, of identifying what the survey was like, is often going to be an instructive moment in reproducibility and in thinking about the ways in which prose can enhance or limit our ability to reproduce science. Because when you try to create the stimuli, as some of you probably have at some point in time, based on what is published in a paper, you will sometimes fall woefully short. So students prepare the stimuli, they try to prepare the study, and the task is to run the study. Now, sometimes I make it easier for them. So for example, this semester, when they read a paper from me, they may have the benefit of having the actual data sheet that I use to collect the data with, right? So they may have some bonuses, but they may not. They then assign themselves. One's a fake experimenter, one's a fake child. If you do survey-based work, you could imagine adapting this in all sorts of ways. And then the goal is to see, can you run the study based on what was written about it? Oftentimes, in class, once people perform the task, we then argue about it. Because I'll have multiple groups perform the same task, and they almost never do it the same way. And so then I say, well, who was right? And it's almost never the case that the reason that there's variation is because of an error on the student's part. Instead, it's because of ambiguities in the prose. And so this act allows us to, in a low-stakes way, critique the quality of the prose in representing the methods of a study. And it gives students this feeling of how important it is to write methods in a reproducible way. Now, I'll give you an example from Shu and Garcia. This is the figure that they used to represent the study. And here is the full procedure that was presented along with the original work. And so students are given this along with the whole paper, and their task is to act it out. Now, since we have the luxury of doing this talk online, for those of you who would like to engage in this activity on your own, please go ahead and pause this video and see if you can figure out what you should do. This is a pretty decent method section, despite being pretty short, and so maybe you'll be able to succeed. For those of you who don't want to pause me, I'll talk about it in just a moment. So pause me now, and when you're done, unpause. Okay, so whether or not you actually completed this activity or tried to or mentally went through it, you can see that your ability to complete this activity is going to hinge entirely on how well the prose within the method section approximates what was actually done. If you did try to do this, you might have noticed that this figure really helped. It probably would not have been possible for you to run the study without this figure. And so this activity serves a secondary purpose, which is that it forces students to think about which elements of a method section or of a paper allow you to reproduce it. And what they end up concluding almost always is that figures are essential, like especially in psychology, diagrams kind of explaining who was sitting where, when, they help a ton. And all of those appendices and supplemental materials that they would normally skip while reading end up being at the absolute center. And those times when the researchers don't tell you the words they used are so frustrating. And now these are experiences that I could comment on papers until my hands get sore, and I have, and students are just not going to think to include those details until they experience the disappointment of trying to reproduce someone else's study and being completely unable to do so because the prose did not accurately capture what happened. Now, I told you I'd talk about writing a method section as another way of training us to think about the reproducibility of our studies in terms of how our prose, how the literal things that we write when we finish our report, shapes our ability to recreate what was actually done. So we have our classic version of writing, and I think as a requisite, peer editing. Not peer editing for grade purposes, but peer editing in the sense of, all right, now you try to run the study. What details are missing? Compare it to your own writing. What details are missing? We also have some modified versions that I just want to share with you because, again, Teaching writing is so critical to the reproducibility movement, and it is so hard and so frustrating, and at this point, so demoralizing to try to do, because it is really hard to train people to write clearly. And so these activities have really helped me. One is to edit my in-preparation work. I give them a video of what the study looked like. I give them the study materials, and they get my in-prep work, and then they get to have the incredibly fun task of destroying it, right? Professor Sullivan, you didn't include this detail. Professor Sullivan, you made a mistake here. You said that you covered the puppet's eyes, but really you covered their eyes and their mouth, and that's important for the following reason. Having students critique my own research, but in a way that helps my research, has been fantastic for improving the quality of their writing, improving their understanding of why reproducibility at the prose level matters, and for doing so in a way that is almost zero cost to me in terms of productivity and time. Relatedly, if you're doing the kind of research where there are videos involved or a record of what the actual experimental session looked like, you could watch a video and write the method section, and then have someone who didn't see the video try to understand what happened, right? The comment that we always give students is like, what if you read it to your roommate? So why not just actually ask them to read it to their roommate and have their roommate try to do what they said? Right? That's the classic, like I remember in 6th grade, they had us write out all the instructions to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And, I wrote out mine and I felt so proud. And I watch as my teacher picks up the bread loaf and it's covered in plastic and just takes a peanut butter knife and smears peanut butter on the top, because I forgot to say, take the bread out of the bag and take out 2 slices and hold a slice in your hand and, just put peanut butter on 1 slice. Having this experience at the college level of needing to write clearly about methods improves the reproducibility of our work. You could also have students write methods based on the data sheet used to collect data, so they don't actually have access to all of the information. I find that sometimes these method sections are the highest quality. And finally, we could have students read reviews and your response to reviewers from under review work. And I appreciate that in different fields there are different ethical considerations here, so you would want to be certain that you were engaging in this ethically, but having students read situations where reviewers have gone to town on my method section because I thought it was crystal clear, all my co-authors thought it was crystal clear, and in fact it was not, is a very valuable lesson in how hard it is and in which details need to be included in order to ensure that our research is reproducible. Now, in order to assess students' ability to process these reviews, I actually do what I call structured responses. They're just Google surveys. When students do homework, whenever they read a paper, or in this case, they read reviewers' comments and my marked up response to reviewers and like my track changes responses, they complete a survey that allows me to assess whether they got what I wanted out of it. So here it says, the reviewers asked the authors to reduce the emphasis on drawing throughout the paper, and critically, one of the conditions was called the drawing condition, so this had a big impact on the method section. How did the authors accomplish this? And I give 4 changes that really happened in the paper. And the students need to connect the dots. They need to figure out which of those 4 changes actually addressed that particular methodological concern. Or, for example, I could ask, why are there no track changes in the participants section? And give a bunch of plausible responses. Only students who really understand the dialogue that happens between a reviewer and a researcher in trying to refine a method section so that it is reproducible at the prose level will be able to answer a question like this. In this case, the correct answer is that sample size and exclusion criteria were pre-registered, so these details weren't going to change even though a reviewer requested that they would. Now, let's think about analytical reproducibility. So I just argued that the prose that we produce, the way we describe our methods, and also the way we describe our introduction and discussion, but I'm not going to talk about that today, shape how reproducible our science is. Now, more people have talked, and I'm going to talk a little bit today, about analytic reproducibility, right? So when I did the tier multi-day event, it was so lovely. That was a couple of years ago now. We focused a lot on reproducible workflows and representing them on open science framework. I'm broadening this out just a little bit in how I'm thinking about analytic reproducibility. And my goal for students is that they can draw a line between a pre-registration, a data file, code, and the final paper. I am not necessarily requiring that they can produce all of these perfectly. That seems like a lot to ask of undergraduates. A thesis student who I can mentor in depth? Absolutely. I want them to be able to deal with each of these components separately. But for me, in order for them to get the reproducibility lesson, what I really want them to be able to do is look at my stuff and draw that line. If they can, then they've deeply understood the study. So that's a pedagogical win right there. And they understand all of the little breadcrumbs that you need to leave in order to make work reproducible. So, for example, in the study I just showed you, where they saw all of the reviews and the response to reviewers, remember how I said some of the conditions were drawing conditions? There were two. There was a create drawing condition and an interpret drawing condition. Well, what did I do? I gave students my R code. These are undergraduate students. They had spent like 3 weeks learning about R. Almost nothing, right? But that's okay, because it turns out if you know what you're looking for, you can start to understand how R code is structured long before you could type it freehand, right? And so I had them look at my RMarkdown files, and I know you guys have already heard a talk on RMarkdown and how wonderful it is. And their job was this. For one of these two conditions, please think about the analysis that tests for age effects. And they had to figure out which analysis that might be. Their job was to copy and paste the formula and highlight the portion that deals with age in one color and the portion that identifies which condition is being analyzed in another color. And this is for me to teach them a little bit about how this R code represents analyses and how R code can call different data sets. In this case, it's calling the create data set. So this is an example of a student response. It's basically okay. I would have preferred that they just highlight age in months. So we have a model called create age. It's a generalized linear model. It's a binomial analysis, and we're predicting correct performance, which is binomial, from age in months, which is continuous, and the data file that we are using has been called create. All right, so here, in order to solve this, they had to read the paper, then they had to go through our markdown code and identify which ones are likely to be related to the analyses that are presented in the paper. Next question, look at the results in the paper. Now look at the results in the RMarkdown output. Using words, highlighting, or some other means, explain how the output of the R code resulted in the words that are in the manuscript. And as you folks already know, our markdown code, it's really nice because you get the code and then right next to it you get the output. So students can solve this task with relatively limited understanding of statistics. And I will argue that that is actually an okay thing. So what they have to do is they have to look in the manuscript and they see, okay, the probability of success as reported in the manuscript, well, 65% of the time in the manuscript, children got the right answer. Now I'm going to look through this code and find an output where the probability of success is 0.65. And then they found it. They were then able to draw a line between the percentages that are presented in the article and the R outputs that they saw. And this is on the basis of 2 or 3 weeks of training in R, right? And so already they're seeing what the relationship is between statistical outputs and the way we talk about them using language, which is actually a skill that until this semester I had never directly taught. I had said, hey, make sure to report your analyses in APA format, or hey, like, look, they found 65% correct, let's talk about what that means. But I had never actually required students to go back and forth between a paper and an analysis code outside of like a senior thesis student. And doing it has caused students to understand so much more about how it is that our analyses support the words that we write in a paper. I'm actually kind of embarrassed it took me that long to teach them that. The next assignment, and again, now we're about 4 weeks into the class, so not very far at all. Can you see that? Yes. Students have to open up the data file, and their job is to go from pre-registration to data file to results. So we're actually making them draw those connections. So in this particular study, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 main outcome variables. They each had a name. And the first task is to look at each outcome variable, read the notes in the data file, and for this analysis, they weren't using R, they were using JMP, which is the other statistical program I teach in. And they had to connect the language from the pre-registration that motivates a comparison to chance for that dependent variable to the dependent variable itself. This is that first step, connecting a pre-registration to a raw data set. So I did the first one for them. So for main task ID, this is the text from the pre-registration that motivates comparing this dependent variable to chance. They then have to fill it out for all of these other variables. Next question. Same variables, now they have to do a comparison to chance, chi-square, Pearson, and they have to interpret it in a loose way. So they have to report the percent who make the correct choice, report the chi-square value that we've already talked about in class, report the p-value, compare the p-value to our alpha, even though we do talk about the limitations to that approach, and then in words say whether children are or are not above chance. Okay, so they have first connected the data file to a pre-registration and motivated each analysis with a pre-registration. Next, they conduct the analysis. And next, they report the results in APA formatting, one for each analysis. I'm basically teaching them step by step and forcing them with this assignment how to create a reproducible kind of breadcrumb trail of what you have done. Finally, they choose one measure above and put everything into prose. As a professor, I can go through this and I can identify any misunderstandings that have popped up, right? I can say your prose is accurate and clear, but your values are incorrect. Or your values are correct, but your motivation for them is actually wrong. And I know that because you actually referred to the wrong part of the pre-registration, right? So this type of analysis, incredibly simple for me to make, incredibly easy to grade, teaches students how to do reproducible analyses. In another assignment, I take a recently published piece of work. So this is a paper about why adults delay conversations about race. Students are instructed to go to the Open Science Framework page, which I will admit is not beautifully organized. It's not perfect. It's real. It's what I actually submitted as my supplemental materials for the paper. They then have to find the pre-registration on Open Science Framework, find the data file. I'm not giving it to them this time. They need to know how to locate it. Find the analysis code, and then I give them the table from our paper, and they have to run the analysis code and check our analysis, see what's wrong. I haven't done this, but you could imagine doing this process for an in-prep work, and it doubles as a pedagogical exercise and a chance for 18 people to check to make sure you haven't done a typo if you're not using like LaTeX or some other way of directly importing your analyses from R or whatever program you're using into your main text. These assignments are super easy to do, and I want to emphasize because it's on my research, it allows me to progress my research and provide students with a level of access that they couldn't get if I was just choosing random data files from the internet. And it simultaneously forces students to engage in reproducible practices and to watch me succeed and fail at doing that too, all of which are, I think, tremendously pedagogically important. Now, the last point I want to make is about design reproducibility, and I have the least to say about that today, but I want to put it in your mind. I don't know about you, but the number of times I have looked at an old data set or an old research project or a paper I published, and I have thought to myself, why did I do it that way? Has been profound. And I don't mean to say that I can't reconstruct it eventually. I usually can, especially because I keep good records and I pre-register my work and I save all my code and all that good stuff. And yet still, even given all of that, the number of times I'm just not really able to reproduce my logic spontaneously is astonishing. Why did we code that variable that way? I'm sure there was a reason. I'm sure I have a document somewhere that explains that reason, but I can't remember it right now. Why didn't we do it differently? Right? You've probably had the experience of having reviewers contact you saying, or in their reviews and say, hey, I don't think the way you did that is the most straightforward way. You should have done it this other way. And maybe in that moment you've had the thought, why didn't we do it differently? Certainly the reviewer had the thought. My argument to you is that in an ideal world, with maximal reproducibility, we should never have the chance to answer any of these questions or to wonder any of these questions for any published piece of work. If we had infinite space in a journal article, and we don't always, or ever really, we would be able to justify why we didn't take all of the paths that we didn't take. Now, most published work that students read does not have strong design reproducibility. And by that I mean these questions that are listed here go unanswered. Students have to think about them and wonder about them and worry about them. And you've probably had that experience too in your own research, where you're trying to respond to a paper that's out there in the world, and as you try to do that, you're like, why did they do it this way? Why didn't they do it differently? Why did they code the variable that way? And if they were producing truly reproducible science, you wouldn't have those questions. Ideally, we should be able to justify so much of our process so transparently that these questions should not typically emerge. So when we think about design reproducibility, perhaps the most important question is, what is the research question and how was it measured? And a lot of times what we're thinking about here is what we would in my field call validity, right? To what extent does the measure that we've gotten actually capture the construct that we care about? I know that term validity has slightly different senses in different fields, but that's how we use it in my world. And so we should be able to reproduce the thought process that went into determining that a particular measure is reliable and valid, right? And so reliability is usually captured analytically, and we can usually just look at what's reported in the paper, so that's okay. But the validity part, not so much. A lot of times we have to guess about it. And one of the problems that I've encountered in working with undergraduates is they often defer to the expert. And this is true for professors too, right? We read the paper and we say, well, they were expert in it. They thought about it for a long time. They probably came up with the best way to do things. But that's rarely true, right? I am humble enough about my own work to know that I've probably never once come up with the best way to do something. I probably always made some kind of a mistake. And so the best I can do is just explain how I got from point A to point B, why I arrived at the decisions, the many, many decisions that I made along the way. And so this can be an act of documenting all the other ways you could have done it, but decided not to. And I often find that we do this in a post hoc way. Again, I'm sure there's field variability about this, but in my field, we have to respond to our reviewers. And oftentimes when a reviewer says something like, oh, why don't you do an ANOVA or whatever on these analyses, I'll say, okay, well, we considered 6 different ways to do these analyses. We pre-registered what we were going to do, and here's why we didn't do these other 5. Now that post hoc justification should not be post hoc and should not be only visible to that reviewer, because other people are likely to have the same question. Now, teaching students to archive their entire thought process is a disaster. I don't recommend doing it, because you're going to get all sorts of stuff that is not really relevant. The way that I teach about this is actually by doing the big no-no, which is I have students p-hack my data sets. I say go for it. Have at it. This is not how we create good science, but it is how we identify how many different choices we could have made. Have fun. Exclude based on whatever criteria you want. Like, come up with any way you want to create this scale. You want to z-score it first? Go for it. You want to not do that? Go for it. You want to exclude the highest 25% of scores? Absolutely, by all means. Oh, you want to split by gender? Please do it. I let students go to town on it. And what they end up with is every single time, if I have 20 students, it's 20 different outcomes, right? And this has been discussed to death, right? I'm not going to talk about it much more. But from a pedagogical perspective, that exercise is so valuable because it makes obvious all the paths not taken. Professor Sullivan took this path, and there were at least 20 other that could have been taken and weren't. And so now they want to know, well, Professor Sullivan, why didn't you split by gender? Why did you z-score things instead of just taking a plain average? And the answers to those questions speak to design reproducibility. In other words, reproducing that magical logical process that got you, the expert, the person who's doing the research, from the research idea to some kind of scientific outcome that is of value. And so I try to emphasize in my classes the importance of being able to reconstruct the thought process and to identify and justify those paths not taken. And p-hacking, I think, is the best way to do it. So I know I'm running short on time, so the end result of all of this is that my students are trained after a very short period of time in thinking about prose analysis and design reproducibility. They care about the extent to which the language used in the paper allows you to literally reproduce the methods. They understand the importance and can do a task that requires them to connect a published or unpublished paper to a pre-registration, to a data set, to an analysis file, and understand and really have to walk through step by step how each of those little nodes is connected. And finally, design reproducibility, being able to reproduce the thought process and the winnowing process that an individual went through when they ruled out different ways they could do a project and chose not to. The other end result is a basically non-tired professor. I have improved the reproducibility of my own research. I have taught my students about reproducibility in a more robust way than I ever previously had. And both of those goals are working together in a way that makes it not a zero-sum game. And so for all of you who are thinking about ways to improve your practice pedagogically and in the lab, I really encourage you to try this approach if you're so bold as to say, here's this class about my own work, because it allows you to make so much more progress when the time spent on teaching and the time spent on research are the same time. And that is that. I have to go now and work on my own research, but thank you so much, and I look forward to the Q&A.